The title of this sermon is a one-word answer, and it's based on 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 15a. Will you pray with me for a moment, please? Lord, for the sake of all living things, may my words not be trite. For the sake of all living things, may your word be heard. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer, you, not me. Amen. What follows a tragedy? What follows a tragedy? For the people of God, the answer is ministry. Ministry. A one-word answer. How simple is that? That may sound underwhelming. That may not sound like what we want to hear. But in that ministry, in the ministry that follows a tragedy, the work of God continues. Because even after a tragedy, the work of God never ends. So what follows a tragedy? For us, it's ministry. Now, I could be talking about any number of things that have happened in my 5 years here at Epworth, up to and including the shooting in Virginia Beach last month. In any case, what follows a tragedy for us, church, is ministry. We could call what happens in 1 Kings 18, the chapter before this, a tragedy, because at the end of that chapter, and just before our passage begins, 450 priests lose their lives. Now, these are priests of Baal who are massacred by Elijah after a showdown in which Elijah proves that God is God and that Baal is a false god, a figment of someone's imagination. As chapter 19, our chapter for today, begins, Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, who rules the northern kingdom of Israel, vows to Elijah to retaliate against him for this, staking her own life against his. And now Elijah appears to be facing a tragedy of his own here. Elijah, fresh from fighting against Baal's worshippers, flees from the queen after killing 450 prophets. He runs with his servant to the southern kingdom of Judah, and then he goes off by himself. In the wilderness, he asks to die because he thinks that the end has come. He thinks that he's failed, that he's no better than anyone else. And he also seems to think that there's nothing left for him as a prophet except for death. That's the only thing left for him is death. So this, he figures, must be the end. This must be the end. So let's just go ahead and get it over with, he declares, because this is a tragedy from which there is no return. A tragedy may seem to start chapter 19, but God is still working through Elijah. The end has not come for God, and maybe that's why there is no rest for Elijah here. Elijah tries to sleep, and what's the first thing that happens? The first thing that happens is that an angel wakes him up and tells him to get up and eat, and Elijah wakes up and sees bread and water there for him. Does that happen more than once? Yes, it does. Because after the first time, Elijah goes back to sleep, and the second time, the angel says exactly the same thing, Elijah, get up and eat. And the second time, the angel adds, because you have a long journey ahead of you. Elijah thinks he's done, but there's still a long journey ahead of him here. So the angel has to say to Elijah twice, get up and eat. The angel has to repeat himself. And there is a lot of repetition here. Everyone repeats themselves, everyone except for Jezebel. God repeats himself because God twice says to Elijah, what are you doing here? Both times Elijah gives God the same answer, telling God, I'm on my run for my life. They've killed everybody but me. I'm the only one left, and I may as well die. So God repeats himself. The angel repeats himself. Elijah repeats himself. And when they're all done saying the same thing twice, God says this to Elijah, and God only has to say it once. God says to Elijah, go back. Go back to the wilderness of Damascus. Go back, Elijah says, because God's work through Elijah isn't done yet. Now, it might be tempting for us, maybe even very tempting for us, to criticize Elijah here for sleeping on the job. And it may be too easy and too tempting for us to point a finger at Elijah and say, well, of course, God said that to him because Elijah was not doing what God had called him to do. But is there any recrimination on God's part here? Is there any upbraiding of Elijah on God's part? God just says twice, perhaps with a note of surprise, "What are you doing here, Elijah? Go back. Go back to the wilderness of Damascus." Again, because there's still work to do. Now, this all might look and sound different than everything that happened in the last chapter, but God is still at work. And we, Elijah, or Epworth, or the United Methodist Church, or whomever we are still part of God's work. It might be tempting for us at times to run away or to want to run away and to go off and hide in the wilderness and even to say to God, "Hey, God, things are getting pretty bad down here. In fact, they're almost tragic, and I just can't take it anymore, God," just like Elijah says. Have we ever felt like this? On any occasion, have we ever felt the way Elijah does here? Have we ever had a Jezebel or an Ahab threatening to retaliate against us tomorrow? We can run and hide if we want, if that happens to us. And if we really think that that's the right thing to do, we can run and hide. But if we do it, don't be surprised if God asks us, "What are you doing here?" Don't be surprised if a messenger or an angel comes to us and says twice if needed, "Get up, because you've still got a ways to go." This chapter may have started off badly for Elijah, and it might appear that way, but it is not the end, even if it appears that way too. Threats are not the end, and are never the end of God's work. We went through verse 15a. Some of the commentaries that I read said we should go 2 more verses through verse 17, or maybe even 4 more verses through verse 19, because if we continue through the 17th verse or the 19th verse, we see that God is very specific with Elijah about the plans that God still has, the plans to anoint another prophet after him, the plans to anoint another king to follow Ahab. God is very specific, telling Elijah, "Get up and get back, because this is what happens next." And Elijah is still part of that work. And if we were to go all the way through verse 19, we would read where Elijah gets up and goes back. You see, Elijah's not supposed to go anywhere, not yet anyway. He's not supposed to go anywhere until the whirlwind comes along and takes him up from heaven, separating him from Elisha, which is a passage for next week. So it's time for Elijah to get back to the wilderness rather than thinking, "This is the end." We may think at times, "This is the end." But the message to us is, "Get up." The message to us is, "What are you doing here?" The message to us is, "Go back to work. This isn't the end. Go back to the wilderness. Go back to ministry." It's a blessing that for us, ministry is what comes after tragedy. It's a blessing for us. The tragedy is never the end. It's a blessing that no matter what threatens us, God is there with us, not just after the tragedy, but in every tragedy, comforting us and guiding us and sending messages to us so that no tragedy, no threat is ever the end for us. So what comes after a tragedy? Ministry. A simple, one-word answer. Maybe we provide that ministry, or maybe that ministry is provided to us, but either way for us, church, what comes after a tragedy? It's ministry. Elijah thought that he was facing the tragedy to end all tragedies. But as bad as things looked, God and Elijah still had work to do. God and God's people still have work to do, always. After anything, even after a tragedy, there is ministry from God and from the people of God. May we always expect this ministry, and may we always be part of this ministry. Amen. Thanks be to God.